to episode 134 of the CRICKETher Weekly. Now, WBBL has started, Sid, and we have been able to watch some of the matches from England, and it's been quite exciting. What stood out for you so far?
We've watched a couple of complete matches and a couple of matches we've seen highlights of, and it's always great to see the fact that Australia put so much effort into kind of scheduling the matches in a way that allows them all to be broadcast, and you can take your choice of the matches. They've all got proper commentary, they've all got proper cameras. For those that don't follow the way that it works in England, we've still got a lot of games in our regional competition where they're almost all live streamed, but they're often live streamed with fixed cameras.
Okay.
And having the kind of full professional broadcast setup is brilliant. And we've also got the DRS, which we've seen employed a couple of times, not entirely successfully.
I thought it was. Can I just say, I thought that it was very considerate of Cricket Australia to schedule the first game so that it starts at 9:30 a.m. UK time. More of that, please.
Yeah, that's always a good thing. And I've enjoyed, the highlight for me has been seeing the Melbourne Stars. Actually, I mean, as a Hurricanes fan, I'm perhaps not allowed to say this, but it's great to see the three England batters coming in at the top of the order. So you've got Lauren Winfield-Hill, Bess Heath, and Alice Capsey opening the batting there. And Lauren Winfield-Hill had a brilliant innings. Just like all the Australians are obviously looking at, this is a surprise. Because obviously when it's almost a different Lauren Winfield-Hill, isn't it? But she's basically brought the same form to Australia's season as she's had in the season here, and she made a big score in the first match. Bess Heath took a little bit of time to get into it in the first match. She made like 25 runs off 30 balls or something. It wasn't a terrible contribution. Obviously, it was the kind of contribution where you're going, you need to do better than that at this level. But she did come in today and did better than that. She's hit over 100 today. She scored like 35 or something.
At a strike rate of over 100.
Over 100. Yeah, sorry, just to clarify, hit at over 100.
Yeah.
So that was great. Alice Capsey didn't make runs today, but she made a few yesterday. But she did a very Alice Capsey innings. She was straight into her running. There were the commentators, of course, also going, who is this Alice Capsey person? Raf shakes her head. But, they're going to find out all about her by the end of the season, I suspect.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's been great. And it's particular, but one thing I really liked was the fact that Bess Heath was given a decent opportunity by the Stars. In fact, a better opportunity than she was given by the Superchargers in the 100. So she's coming in at 2. She's possibly only going to be there for the first couple of games.
She's been someone else is
coming in, aren't they? I can't remember who. Okay. Sorry.
That's all right.
Apologies.
We're just Bess Heath fans.
But give these players these opportunities, and they'll come through. It's the same as Freya Kemp in the England shirt. Give them enough opportunities, and they'll shine. And I really believe in these players. And so I hope that she makes the most of her opportunity, even if it is brief. And give the selectors something to worry about there.
Great.
So,
okay.
Awesome.
Now there has been some talk about WBBL, which obviously for quite a long time has kind of been the unrivaled leader in the global landscape of women's franchise tournaments, let's be honest. But suddenly, this time around, I think partly because of the success of the 100, partly because it's coming on the back of an announcement that we are going to get a kind of proper women's IPL, whereby you actually have genuine number of teams playing a number of matches. It's not just the kind of challenge that we've had so far. We've also got the prospect of a Pakistan Women's League, and we've had a Caribbean Women's Premier League, etc., etc. So suddenly there's starting to be a little sense in which the WBBL might be under threat. And actually, Brittany Carter and Kristen Beams on their new WBBL podcast tackled this subject, and they were actually saying, does the WBBL have anything to worry about from these other tournaments? So what do you make of that, Sid?
Well, does it? Yeah, I mean, it does and it doesn't. I think that as we've said, that the WBBL remains the kind of preeminent domestic tournament, and the domestic game, because it's so strong in Australia, that it feels like they're a little bit less reliant on the huge overseas stars. You feel that the up-and-coming women's IPL, there's been a little bit of disappointment about it, because the rumour is it's going to be 5 teams, not the same number of teams as in the men's IPL, the MIPL, as we should be calling it from now on.
Really?
No. But there's been a little bit of disappointment, but actually it's going to wind up being the same number of games as there were in the 100 this year, I believe, because of the one less game in the 100.
Okay.
So it's certainly a very similar number of games. So it's definitely, as you say, it's a huge difference between playing 25 games in a season and playing the sort of 4 games that were being played in the exhibition kind of challenge tournament. So I think that there's going to be a big emphasis on overseas players here. I think that's what's going to sell it, and that they're going to be looking for that to sell it around the world as well. And that'll be a positive from them selling the TV rights and things like that. But I think that Australia's domestic strengths are such that it's still going to be like the preeminent competition. There's been some interesting talk over the last couple of weeks as well. It's like some players have been suggesting they should shorten the WBBL because it's too long, and they're worried about its space in the calendar. I feel really uncomfortable about this. I think that the reason it's so good is because it's a proper long tournament. It gives you actually time to get into it, to kind of build form, to build run. It also gives you a time to come back. Like from the very first season when Sydney Sixers, started off so disastrously, and then they had their Sixers are going vertical hashtag, and the hashtag was definitely the entire reason that they leapt up the table and ended up winning the thing in the first season, I believe. So a long tournament, whereas it gives you the ability for teams to kind of get into it and to come back from a bad start, whereas in the 100 it really felt this year like if you lost your first 2 or 3 games, then you were stuffed and you might as well get on the plane and fly home, and feel some people almost literally did that.
But it is a balancing act, isn't it? Because obviously the from a player perspective, if you can get paid the same amount as you'd get in the WBBL for playing in a shorter competition, then it's a little bit of a no-brainer, isn't it? Because you are going to, therefore, and everyone's talking now about, because the women's game is more professional and there's a tighter schedule or a more crowded schedule, players are tired. And so really, how long is the prestige of the WBBL going to outweigh shorter competing tournaments? So I think it's definitely a balancing act, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But on the other hand, the other side of that coin is that a shorter tournament is going to mean less interest. It's going to mean less viewers. It's going to mean possibly less TV coverage. I mean, you could obviously, because they've only got a certain number of games broadcast on proper TV in the WBBL, then they could have half the length of the tournament and still give the Fox the games they've signed up to, but it's not really what you want to do. How happy are Fox going to be if you go, well, it's going to be half the tournament now? They kind of build that into their schedules and things. So I think that will be a real mistake to kind of reduce that. And that's one of the reasons that players want to go over there and play in it. I think that ultimately, actually, playing in a lot of short tournaments, we talked about this around Fair Break, that playing in a lot of short tournaments is actually psychologically really difficult because you're like here for 3 weeks, then you're here for 3 weeks, then you're here for 3 weeks, and that's really tough on you to kind of moving around the world like that. Whereas a longer tournament gives you actually time to settle in somewhere and feel part of it, and I think that that's important, actually, particularly for those kind of jet-setting players, your Lizelle Lees and Deandra Dottins that are going around the world, to have a little bit of a longer tournament. So I hope that Australia keep the faith and keep it as a longer tournament, because I think that's one of the things that ensures it remains the kind of the blue ribbon tournament in terms of all these domestic franchises. Because there's certainly no doubt, that the 100 was a great tournament this year. I don't
think I agree with you, to be honest. I think that Cricket Australia are going to come under enormous pressure to reduce the length, and I don't know that they can necessarily just sit on their laurels and go, okay, well, we're the best tournament and we can rely on people coming and playing here. And I think that to a certain extent there's an argument that actually we shouldn't be setting up the calendar around players like Lizelle Lee and Deandra Dottin, because aren't we then encouraging people to quit international cricket and to then go off and just go, okay, well, I can just play in all of these short form tournaments and that's fine. And that's what we're obviously seeing in men's cricket. Do we want to then be encouraging that to happen in women's cricket? I guess that it's perhaps inevitable in some ways that it's going to go that way, but I don't know that we should be encouraging it. So I don't know if we should be setting up the schedule around those kind of players. From my perspective, actually, it's potentially quite exciting that you're going to have opportunities for more players, because if some of your big shot players are going to say, okay, well, I'm going to play in the women's IPL instead of playing in the WBBL or instead of playing in the 100, then that opens up opportunities for other players. And actually what we saw with the first year of the 100, which was during COVID, which meant that some of the big shot Australian players like Alyssa Healy, like Meg Lanning, like Elise Perry didn't come to England because COVID, I guess, and they didn't need the money, let's be frank, and so therefore there wasn't that incentive for them to come, and so we did see players like Sammy Jo Johnson having a great time for the Trent Rockets, and really, actually, to some extent, the crowds didn't care that it was Sammy Jo Johnson, not like Alyssa Healy, because a lot of them hadn't watched very much women's cricket before. And then actually, to some extent, then what we saw in the second season was, okay, well, some of those slots are now being filled by your players who are then going to go and dominate every women's franchise, and so you didn't get that same kind of spreading out of the love, spreading out of some of the financial kind of rewards. Yeah. So I think this could be quite exciting from a player perspective. And I also think that potentially what it does is it creates more of a market for players, and it means that actually the boards, who by and large are organising these tournaments, with the exception of Fairbreak, it's the boards who are organising the tournaments, who are bankrolling the tournaments, it puts pressure on them to up the players' salaries. And that's really exciting because to some extent, what we want is the women to be paid the same as the men, or to be paid more anyway. And so actually, if what Cricket Australia need to do is to up the salaries in WBBL, or the ECB need to really put some welly into matching the men's salaries in the 100, which are preposterously bigger than the women's salaries, in order to attract those best players, then that's brilliant for women's cricket, actually.
Because you can be sure that that's what the women's IPL was going to do. The Women's T20 Challenge has always been, in terms of the number of games you play, for the amount of money you get, it's always been by far the best paid tournament that there is available for these players. And if they keep those kinds of salaries, then actually, even your Meg Lannings are going to be going, well, that's going to double my income for the year if I have that. So that's kind of interesting as well. Yeah. Okay.
So we did also put out a call for your questions on Facebook and Twitter, and so we will now spend the rest of the episode answering a couple of those. So the first one that came in, the Asia Cup has been great. India, of course, this week were triumphant in the Asia Cup against Sri Lanka in the final. So the Asia Cup has been great, but dominated by bowlers. Why are the Asian teams so good at producing bowlers, but, except India, less so batters compared to the rest of the top nations? I'm going to let you take that one, Sid.
It is a really interesting question, isn't it? Because there's absolutely no doubt that all of these Asian teams, when we look at them, when they come into the major tournaments, so we look at like the Sri Lankas, and they're very dependent upon one or two batters. And Thailand came in, when they came in and played in the T20 World Cup, it was their bowling that was their real strength, and it was obvious that they weren't going to make a huge amount of runs with the bat, but they could challenge teams by out bowling them, and they did in a couple of instances really put pressure on some of those bigger teams by doing that. So why is that? Well, the bottom line is that we don't really know. It could, of course, just be a coincidence, right? It could be one of those things which is like looks like a pattern, but it's just like the normal, vagaries of these things. Sometimes bowlers are on the up, and sometimes the batters are on the up. But I think there are some aspects to it. There's certainly, there's a little bit of, you can only be what you can see, which means that if you've got strength in spin bowling, then younger people coming through their age group systems are going to see other spin bowlers, and they're going to be coached in that spin bowling, for instance. So because it is spin bowling in particular, not even just pace bowling, but spin bowling. So if you're a 13, 14-year-old girl and you're playing cricket for the first time, and the best player in your club is also a spin bowler, you're going to look up to her and go, well, you're going to ask her the questions, and she's going to come to you and coach you on how to do that. So that kind of pushes in that direction, I think. It's also interesting to compare it because in other parts of the world there was something else going on. Because what we've seen in the African sides, again, if we exclude South Africa, where cricket is so much of a bigger game, but the emerging African sides, we've seen huge dominance of batting. So much so that we've seen batting records smashed in competitions between the African sides, because their batting is really good, but their bowling is poor. So that's happened in a similar vein. So just different things just grow up in these different nations. And what we want to do, obviously, is to try and, ideally, what we want to be doing is to ensure that these kind of sides are meeting each other rather than just meeting within their own communities, if you like. So want to be ideally seeing the African sides be able to take on the Asian sides, rather than African sides always playing African sides, Asian sides always playing Asian sides among the minor nations, because that will help kind of spread those skills, and they'll see those other skills, and it will hopefully kind of start to reconfigure the game more globally. So I think that could be something that the ICC should kind of look at, allowing those sides to find competition against across continents rather than always within the continents.
Okay. Obviously that's being done at the moment because it's cheaper. So you need to find money from somewhere. But
it always comes down to money, doesn't it?
Yeah, sadly. Okay, another question. How do we incentivise cricket boards to properly invest in women's cricket in their countries so that the women's game can be professional in enough countries for a fully vibrant women's game?
Well, it's what we want, isn't it, Raf? What's the answer?
Well, I think a couple of points I would make on this. The first is that when I read this question, I immediately thought of the kind of competitive rivalry between England and Australia that I think has really encouraged greater investment in women's cricket by both those countries. So, for example, one of the main reasons that England introduced the first fully professional contract for any women's team in the world in 2014 was because they were trying to keep up with the pace of Australia, who the previous year had invested even more money, and so their women's team were better paid, if not yet fully professional. Australia then subsequently made their national team fully professional. They introduced the WBBL, so the ECB introduced the Kia Super League, and then subsequently the 100, and etc, etc, etc. You know, we're now making our domestic system professional because Australia's domestic system is professional. And that historic Ashes rivalry, which exists in women's cricket just as much as it has in men's cricket, has really driven that increased investment. And I think to a certain extent, you know, you've seen it with some of the other historic rivalries that there's been in the men's game. I think India versus Pakistan, for example, there was to some extent a little bit of a battle between India and Pakistan, the boards there, to invest more in their women's cricket team. I guess India is now pulling away in that respect, so that's perhaps fallen by the wayside slightly, but there is still that huge competitive urgency when those two teams play each other. So I think one of the things I would say is that teams need to kind of find their nemesis, find their nearest rival, and try and kind of harness that in the harness that in order to get this increased investment from the boards, perhaps.
Yeah, it's certainly something that fans pay a huge amount of attention to. We can see it already in the way that the ECB are hyping up the Ashes for next summer. That, you know, we've seen the schedule announced already. It was almost unheard of that we had a schedule announced, you know, like 9 months in advance or something.
Yeah.
And it feels like only yesterday the schedule would be announced perhaps a week in advance. They'd tell us when they were going to be, when exactly where the next internationals were going to be.
Yeah, so the Ashes is obviously a really big deal.
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, so, you know, be Batman, find your Joker.
Yeah, something like that. So that's one thing I'd say. I think the second thing is that it's partly on all of us as people who support women's cricket to try and put pressure on the boards, and I would hope that that's what you and I have done to some extent, Sid, particularly obviously in the English context. In a way, what we're trying to do, and one of the reasons why some people at the ECB don't like us very much, is we're trying to shame them into investing more in women's cricket. And I think people don't like it when you make them feel ashamed, but shame is a very potent force in terms of getting that increased investment. So, for example, a few years ago when you wrote that piece on CRICKETher, that they were running a Pledge for Parity International Women's Day campaign on the same day that the England women's team flew in economy class while the England men's team flew in business class to the same tournament in the same country. And that shamed them, and they did something about it, and now the women fly business class to international tournaments. Now, not necessarily saying that we were directly responsible for that, but we certainly, I think shame had a real role to play there. So that's kind of what we're trying to do, isn't it?
Everyone needs to make their voices heard, basically, because you can bet that people in the men's game are making their voices heard. So, for instance, in England, there's a lot of competition for money at the moment, you know, and the women's game is competing for money effectively with the men's domestic game, for example, because the men's domestic game can't support itself any more than the women's domestic game can, unfortunately. They're all dependent upon essentially men's test cricket to fund them in the way that it works in this country. And you can bet that everyone from the men's game, from the men's domestic game, are putting huge pressure on the ECB to kind of up their budgets and to give them more money, to give them a bigger slice of the cake. So the women need to be doing that as well. And, you know, part of our role and part of your role as fans is to kind of ensure that those voices are heard.
Yeah.
So make your voices heard.
Another example would be when Izzy Westbury wrote that, that had that scoop in the Telegraph about the fact that the Indian team hadn't been paid their prize money for the T20 World Cup for coming runners-up in 2020, and I think it was like over a year later they still hadn't been paid. So she published that story, And there was an enormous outcry on social media about it. So lots of Indian fans tweeting saying, this is unacceptable. What are you going to do about it, BCCI? Funnily enough, within a couple of weeks, that prize money had reached the bank accounts of the players. Now, obviously, complete coincidence, Sid, nothing to do with that. But, so it's that. So I think journalists, to some extent, we have powerful outlets for our voices, but I think Twitter and other social media, you have power as well. Everyone has power. They have that voice that they didn't have kind of 10 years ago. So that's what I would say.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Well, if you do have any more questions and you would like to see them answered in future episodes, we are very happy to answer them, and we will do our best to do so. So do send them in. As ever, thank you for tuning in. Bye for now.
Bye.